Hi, I'm your host, Anand J. Sukadia, and this is the Limitless One podcast. Join me on this journey as I interview the most inspirational souls who are tapping into their limitless blueprint on a mental, physical, and spiritual level to thrive in uncertain times. If you feel you are so much more than just this body, just this life, and want to tap into your limitless potential, you're in the right place. Here we go, Starseeds. Welcome to the Limitless One podcast. Dr. Hemal Patel, how are you, sir?
Good to see you.
Great to see you. So, I'm super excited to have you on. I had the privilege of meeting you at the Dr. Joe Dispenza event down in Florida back in January. And you gave this amazing presentation that blew the minds of myself and pretty much everyone else in the audience. And I'm honored to have you talk about your groundbreaking research as you're heading up the world's largest effects of meditation study. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. Yeah, we love talking about the research that's going on and get other people excited about it. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, so up the alley of the Limitless One podcast because we're all about finding a limitless life and how do we get there. And meditation, as I've learned scientifically now, is pretty much one of the best things you can do for your overall health, mind, body, spirit. I've known that as a person who engages in it, but scientifically, you've actually proven that to be the case. So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and the research that you've worked on in the past?
Sure. So I trained so I did got a couple bachelor's degrees. So I started off as a biology major in college. This was with the intent that I would eventually go to medical school and become a physician, right? I mean, if you were Indian, you had two choices. You became a lawyer or a physician at that time.
I failed
Um,
both, by the way.
what was that?
I failed both of those, by the way.
I failed one of them as well. So I don't know. I became a doctor, but in a different light, and I can talk about that. And I went to a small liberal arts school in northern Missouri, and the focus of a liberal education was that if you were a declared science major, you had to be well rounded. And so we had to take classes in literature and history and the humanities and other things, right? And so I thought, well, why don't I take an intro to philosophy class and just see what it's like? And I just fell in love with philosophy. I had this amazing professor, Natalie Alexander, who was just blew my mind in terms of thought, and it was a survey course. Um, and so she's like, "Oh, I mean, I did well in her class. I'm a Southeast Asian, so this is sort of in our blood to just continue to sort of trudge along and work hard on sort of these academic endeavors." And it was interesting that I picked up on things that I had grown up learning about in Hinduism, but never really understood, and applying some of that ideas of how life and existence and things come into this philosophical course. She encouraged me to take more classes. So then I actually ended up declaring a double major in biology and philosophy religion. Along that path, I discovered Western theology. So did quite a lot of historical dive into Western theology. Even took 2 semesters of Koine Greek, which is biblical Greek. So at one time, I could actually read parts of the Bible in the original language. And so after that, the thought was, well, what do I do with the rest of my life? And so I'd set myself up for those two things. Most biologists went on to get medical degrees, and most philosophers went on to get that law degree because that gave you that grounding in logic and philosophical argument. I ended up really falling in love with research. And so I'm the only PhD in a family of MDs. All the kids became MDs. I chose this alternative path of doing research. Ended up at the Medical College of Wisconsin, got my PhD in a very broad area called pharmacology and toxicology. And I purposely chose this because then I'd have the option to work in any living system that I potentially could dream up and work on. My PhD was focused on the heart. We were looking at how to protect the heart from an ischemic event. So when someone has a heart attack, the problem is usually the first sign of a heart attack is that you're having that heart attack, and most people die from that event because you get this massive necrotic injury that happens. And so our lab was focused on trying to figure out how we could intervene to protect that tissue from dying during this ischemic event that an individual has. We went on to show through a series of papers, and it was a very collaborative group. So we got to know grad students that came well before us and after us, and it was just a nice family of science that we did. Hundreds of papers published in this area. And so that was my sort of foray into the initial workings of science and research. Typically, what happens after you finish your PhD is like what an MD does to go off and do the residency. A PhD scientist goes off and does what's called a postdoctoral fellowship. So my wife, who I met in high school, was an MD, did her training at the Medical College of Wisconsin, where I got my PhD. She was in the Navy, so matched to the San Diego program. So I'm like, I guess there's worse places we can end up. We ended up in San Diego. I did my postdoc here in the pharmacology department, and the rest is history. We just never left. It's just an amazing academic and sort of world environment to be in San Diego. So
Beautiful. Yeah. Now it makes total sense as to what kind of led you into the study that you're doing right now, because you had the background of learning about world philosophy, world religion, and marrying that with science. I'm sure you don't meet a lot of people who are double majored in philosophy and pre-med.
yeah, maybe not, and it's interesting. I had a guru in college, right? I mean, my uh, Eastern theology professor was my sort of background in philosophy of religion comes from two mega Germans in my life. And so Lloyd Pfluger was this amazing guy who taught Eastern religion and theology. He was a German that spent time in India, became a Hindu. And then the Western counterpart was this guy whose name was Dr. Mark Appold. And he was the local pastor at the Lutheran Church. And he was a Renaissance guy. I mean, spoke 7 languages, knew all of the original biblical kinds of languages, and taught around Western theology. And so these are the two individuals that grounded my sort of religious philosophy and theology training. And with Lloyd, I actually spent time. He became sort of my meditation guide. He and I share this cosmic bond. He whispered this mantra in my ear almost 3 decades ago, and the only time it was ever spoken was when he whispered in my ear. I've never spoken it out loud. He's never done this as well, and he and I share this intense bond. And so I meditated quite heavily as a college student. I mean, you got to figure out how to get by on 3 hours of sleep, and meditation is the way to do it, right? 20 minutes of meditation feels like a 6-hour nap almost. And so it was very intense, and then life catches up with you. And really, I didn't think about it for the next however many decades until we started working with Joe Dispenza.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about how you met Dr. Joe Dispenza and how this opportunity came about for you to start researching people's minds during meditation?
Yeah, so what I've learned in academic medicine and research is that you come across people and you develop these relationships over time. And so one of the experiments we were doing when I was a junior faculty, so I did, as I mentioned, I got my postdoc and did my postdoc in pharmacology. And then to stay at UCSD, I actually transitioned as a junior faculty member into the Department of Anesthesiology. It's a clinical department, but they tend to recruit a lot of PhDs that have a pharmacology background. And so it was a nice fit. We were doing research at the time with a couple anesthesiologists. One of the experiments that we were doing at the time was to put into an office an MD and a PhD. The idea was that at the end of the day, you would start talking to each other, and that MD would rub off on the PhD to make the PhD start thinking about problems that affect the human condition. Most PhDs are in their molecular world where, what is the application of this protein to the rest of biology? But by working with an MD, you can really see how your science then can impact human life and the experience. And then at the counterpart was to get that MD to think like this PhD. How do you design the perfect experiment? How do you control things? How do you put elements like this? And so I shared my office with Toby Muller-Bertram. So Toby was a junior faculty member in the department as well. He had finished his MD PhD training, had become a pain specialist, was practicing pain kinds of stuff and doing research in PTSD. We shared an office for, it seems like almost a decade. and we became really good friends. We talked a lot of science, talked a lot of medicine. We never really interacted scientifically. He then left the university and started his own just mega clinic, very successful in the Palm Desert area in California. I think it's like 18, 19 clinics that he runs now. When the opioid crisis hit, he started experimenting with alternative approaches to pain management, and meditation was one of these. And one of the practitioners in his clinic, Dr. Hillary Hamilton, who's been involved with our research endeavors for a number of years as well, said, "Oh, do you mind if I do some meditations?" And she was a Joe student, so she started showing Toby some of these things, and they were seeing some good results. Joe actually visited their clinic. They were Toby was very busy. You know, you can imagine a busy pain clinic. Then Joe had invited Toby to come to an event. Toby went to an event, and like most of us, right, when we go to a week-long event, our minds are skeptical first entering, and then you go through that experience and you're just blown away. And so Toby was blown away by what he saw, just amazing healings, and people having these emotional experiences that change and transform who they are. And he went up to Joe and said, "Hey, we got to study this." And Joe said, "I know." And Toby said, "I've got a guy." And so I'm the guy. So things come back full circle in academia, right? You just never know what those contexts eventually end up being. And Toby remembered that we do really cool cell molecular biology, biochemistry, and this is where this research needed to head. I don't think anyone in the world will argue that meditation creates stress relief and has some health benefits tied to that. The question then really ultimately becomes how, right? And so we're trying to get to that how is there a molecular biochemical program that the mind launches to fix the body, or is it really all in your mind, which is what most people think, right? And so we're trying to define that boundary.
Beautiful, beautiful. And then I heard you mentioned that you were offered this opportunity to start doing it, but like you had the samples, the blood samples that they sent you, like you
Yeah.
just ignored them for 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very busy research laboratory. I've been funded, knock on wood, for a number of years through the Veterans Affairs system, as well as the NIH. And then we've had grants over the years from NASA, from DoD, from other entities. And so this is how most academic labs exist. And so we had a lot of projects ongoing. At any given time, there's 30, 40 projects ongoing in the lab. We're working, we have a very collaborative laboratory. Like most scientists, we have some niche things that we've become experts in. And so then everyone calls on you to do these things. And so my lab is really a core place where we can do mitochondrial energetics and structure and function kinds of things. In most diseases, mitochondria become dysfunctional. This is how you use and generate and utilize energy in a living system. And for a living system to grow, survive, do its normal function, you have to have energy. And that really ties back down to mitochondria. And so we've developed over the last couple, 15, 20 years of real expertise in how to look at mitochondria at a deep level. And so at any given time, we're working with, 5, 10, 15 groups looking at mitochondrial projects. And so at that time, we were heavily invested in that aspect of the lab. And so for 25, 30 samples from individuals to come in and say, "Hey, start looking at this," in an area where like, yeah, it's meditation. Well, what are we really going to see in that sample? It was a hard sell to people working in the lab. I can sort of ask them to look at them, but it's really, how do you put them into the flow of all the other things that have to get done? And so they, like I've said, they literally sat in the freezer for about 3 or 4 months before we ever even started looking.
Yeah. And then what was the catalyst to make you decide, okay, let's start looking at this? And then from there, what would prompted you to start really getting heavily involved in this? Because this is such a massive undertaking. Eventually it became, but probably at the time, what were your thoughts going into this unknown? It's not a
Yeah.
lot of people have done this before.
Yeah. I consider myself a natural procrastinator. So until someone bugs me or I have a deadline, I don't really move. I think it's sort of a thing that a lot of us fall into. There's certain individuals that are just action oriented and just get stuff done. I have so much stuff on my plate that I have to hierarchically organize, and the things that my mind gravitates to are the things that I'm super excited by. This meditation stuff was sort of cool. I didn't really know who Joe was. I, met him for a couple hours at this event. Um, but then there was, Toby asking, "Hey, have you looked at some of those samples?" Hillary asking, "Hey, have you started working on those?" And then Joe started asking as well. So I'm like, I got to get these people something, right? And so we just started messing around with it in the lab. And so I had a fellow who was going to take on this project, and I've talked about Juan. You've seen him on the stage at some of these events. He's just an amazing guy, just super hard worker, constantly running around like a chicken with its head cut off kind of thing. He's always into every project and doing all these amazing things. And so I said, "Hey, could you just scan these for me and look to see if there's some change in some of the composition?" So the idea was, how could we do something that costs us very little time and money to get at a core answer whether this is worth pursuing? So at the time, we were starting to focus on things called exosomes. And so exosomes are essentially, for the last couple of decades, were thought of as garbage that sloughed off your cell membranes and they floated around. If you look at it under a microscope, an electron microscope that you can get at really high magnification, it literally looks like dirt and specks of dirt sitting around. If you go super high magnification, it turns out that this dirt actually has shape. There's membranes and sort of some meat to these things. Turns out that these are signaling entities that are secreted off of cells in a very controlled process. So it's not just garbage coming off, but it's actually material that the cell uses to communicate with other cells at a distance or cells around it itself as well. There have been lots of evidence, and some of the cool studies done in this protein that we were working on called caveolin is there are these really cool studies done where you took a prostate cancer or a cancer cell line that was heavily expressing caveolin and put it in a dish right next to normal cells. And what they noticed is that over time, these normal cells became cancerous. And so there was something that this cell over here was secreting that then transformed this cell into a cancer cell type. And so it turned out that this cell was secreting some biological material through these exocytic pathways. These exosomes then made their way to this other cell, incorporated it into them, and changed. So the thought was, if the mind is doing something to the body and it's recreating a new sort of environment physiologically in a molecular sense, the idea was that the best bet would be that the brain neurons were somehow in this elevated emotional state, sloughing off pieces of themselves, and then they were circulating around and creating this potential downstream. So we had the blood, right? And so you could measure exosomes and particles and things like that in the blood. So one scanned them. I mean, scanning, 25, I think it was like 25 match samples pre-post. Took about a day and a half to do. And then when he looked at the profiles, there were some interesting changes in the profiles. We noticed that only in the two meditator groups, we had a control, a novice group of meditators and an experienced group of meditators. We saw no real major changes in the controls, but in both the novice and the experienced meditators, after that week long in Indian Wells, we saw this dramatic elevation of these exosomes.
Can we just describe what the novice is versus the advanced real quick?
Yeah, so we have an arbitrary cutoff. So these are all observational studies. So an observational study is there's a group of people that are coming together. We then observe them in unique ways. And so you have to have certain cutoffs that we can define what one group are observing versus the other. The controls in our study have typically been vacationing controls. So they're attending the event with the spouse or they're in that hotel, but they're not attending the week-long workshop. So they're relaxed, right? They may be doing some work, but they're really sitting at the pool, having a fun, relaxing time. The novice experience are individuals that have been meditating less than 6 months. And so they're really new to this practice, and they've never been to a live Joe Dispenza event. So they haven't gone through the process of learning and really sort of expanding their mind. And then the experienced meditator is that which has been meditating more than 6 months, and they've been to one or more live events. And most of our experienced meditators in these cohorts have been to 4, 5, 6 events. So they're really experienced. And then they really incorporate this. Most of them practice aspects of meditation, upwards of hour plus a day. So it's really a core part of who they are. It's like exercising, or so a lot of it's breathing, right? I mean, it's an element of their daily survival that they incorporate into their lives. So
Yeah,
those are the three groups.
I
Yeah.
just like to share something. So like when I went to the event, it was my first event, and when I was online and I was talking to people at lunch and stuff, I heard people coming 17 times, 13 times, 5 times. I'm like, if it's so great, why do you keep coming? Why don't you just like
Right.
ride with it,
Yeah.
right? But they're like, no, it's so addictive. This feeling that you get every single time they come, they get recharged, and then they're able to spread more like value and love into the world
Yeah.
because of this. Not only coming to the meditation, doing the meditations, but the community that is there, it creates a like an exponential effect of positivity around themselves. So that's why people come over and over and over.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons that quantum, that study that we did in Marco Island, that you got to experience or be around those individuals that were in it. That was really the intent: is what is the individual experience and what is the collective experience of that room going through that week-long process. And it's something that we've been sort of thinking about for quite a while: is how do we capture that element? And this is what then launched this really massive study to look at a large group of people doing something over that week. We have a weekly meditation group that's formed in San Diego, and I admit, I mean, it's tough for me to find an hour to meditate a day. There's certain days where I'll find space in my office to do it. The experience I get individually, I can get, I can get the brain tingly kind of funky feeling that you get when you're meditating, and it's a euphoric kind of feeling. But it's not the same when you're around a group of people that are experiencing same thing. So I think there is something to this collective energy and this augmentation of your experience. And I think this is why people keep coming back event after event after event. And I think they see transformations in their lives, and they want to continue to evolve their life and their process.
Yeah, for sure. So can you tell us a little bit about the quantum study and like what the parameters were that you were doing and what you wanted to actually, what were the questions that you wanted to solve in that?
Yeah, so this, it was in January. It seems like it was like 3 years ago, doesn't it? At least
Yeah.
in my mind, so much has happened since Marco Island. I can't even remember that beach or that experience. And so we've only been working with Joe Dispenza for 2 years this past February. It seems like we've been working on this stuff for almost 10 years. And so the way we originally started was we wanted to really do some deep phenotyping. And so in order to do that, it's super expensive. And so you can't look at 1,000 people. You have to look at a small subset because you have to be able to coordinate time for them to get brain mapped, time for them to give and donate blood for samples and things like that, time to get them hooked up to Garmin's and all of the other sort of measurement devices that we're looking at. Um, the it's a very satisfying experiment to do because we're slowly progressing to capture large data sets over an extended period of time. The dissatisfying aspect of that is when you were at an event, there's more than 30 people there, right? And so the thing is, we're missing a lot of the stuff that's happening. And most of the studies that we were doing initially were on the healthies. And so we weren't really capturing individuals that were there to transform their lives from diseases and maladies that are plaguing them. And so this is how quantum was born. So I was sitting around trying to think of how could we incorporate a larger study where we capture a bigger portion of the room to see what's happening. And so recently I've started naming all our studies. And so quantum stands for the quest to analyze 1,000 humans meditating. When we were in Marco Island trying to launch this and trying to get all these people into the study, it felt like we bit off way more than we can chew. I mean, it was a lot. But at the end of the day, the subjects were very patient. I mean, I was amazed to see how easily it was for people to just sort of wait in line their turn, get access to the staff to help them set up. At the end of the day, we ended up enrolling 978 people into quantum. And so if you round up, we got our 1,000, right? So we were able to see 1,000 humans meditating. The goal of that study was to restrict no one from entering the study. So typically in the past, when we put a solicitation out that we were doing research at one of these events, we would get 600, 700 people volunteering to be subjects. And sadly, out of that 600, we could only pick 25 or 30 people because of the nature of those studies. I would constantly get comments and emails, and people would come up to me if I was at the event and say, "Hey, what do I need to do to get into your study?" And quantum was sort of born out of that idea: is how could we do a study where we don't have to turn anyone away, where we could literally take any comer who wants to be involved in being studied. And so there was no exclusion other than your voluntary thing. If you didn't agree to consent to the study, after you were informed about what we were going to do, you could opt out. Even with that, we got 978 people. The goal was to have them do two things that would be very non-intrusive to their meditative experience. We want to make sure that they were going to go through that week without having to feel like they're being looked at under a microscope kind of thing. So the two simple things we thought of was that we could do health surveys. Studies do this all the time. We sent out a pre-health survey before the event started so we could get a capture of what their health status is, how they view all the things in their life, emotionally, physically, sort of mental health-wise as well. And then the idea was to do this right as the event ended as a post capture, and then to follow up at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months to see what happened after you leave. Did you go to more events? Do you see this sort of accelerating correction of things that you found were wrong with you, or things that you were working on in yourself before you started that event? So that we thought was not going to be super intrusive, right? You answer a bunch of questions. You do this every time you go to a doctor's office when you fill in the intake paperwork. The second aspect was we wanted that's self-reported. So you can say whatever, right? So the idea was, could we capture something that someone can't basically invent about themselves, kind of thing? Some measure of what's happening in their body. And so one of the things that we've been sort of playing around with in our sort of more detailed study is looking at biometrics and ways of capturing in a non-invasive way data constantly in a 24/7 fashion. So everyone in quantum got one of these, a Garmin Vivo Smart device. So these are amazing, right? You don't even feel them on your wrist. They go on. Other than the annoying aspect that you got to charge them once a day because we're collecting so much data. There's really no intrusive aspect. You put it on your wrist and you forget about it, kind of thing. It measures your heart rate. We can get heart rate variability through beat to beat interval kinds of things. Measures your sleep, your activity, aspects of your stress, and those kinds of things. And so we get a lot of information in a very passive way, and you're not consciously really thinking about it, right? You're sitting at that event, you're going through the meditations, this thing's on your wrist capturing all of that information. So now we have this information on 978 people in the room, all over the room. And so you can start to see where quantum gets really exciting, right? We've got biometric data on almost 1,000 people. We know what their health status is in terms of what they report to us before and after the event and at follow-up. A lot of our subjects have continued to wear these garments when they went home, and we're continuing to collect data on them as well. So that was the initial in. The ones that were a little more adventuresome, we asked for one more aspect that was voluntary. We asked them in the consenting process to agree to give us some biospecimen collections. We wanted to look at an even more detailed aspect of their biological change and things that they were experiencing throughout that year, or throughout that week, and then ultimately throughout that year. The question for the research team was, how could we do some aspect of collection that we could make kits for and give to individuals so that they could do it on their own, because manpower becomes the limiting thing. In this detailed study we're doing, we have to get blood, and so you got to really, poke a vessel and get blood out, and that takes 10 to 15 minutes to turn over. If we ideally in my world, I would have loved to gotten 1,000 blood samples that way from individuals. We were doing the math yesterday. We're doing a big study in San Diego, and I think we're going to bleed 90 people 3 times a week, 3 times during the week. And I think we calculated that each time it would be about 2 hours of work for 5 people constantly bleeding to do that. So now you can imagine to get 1,000 people to do that would take you all day times a team of 20 people just doing blood work. It made no sense. So the thought was, let's think of something we can collect that they could do on their own. And so one of the interests of the lab and UCSD in general, and a lot of the scientific community right now, is the microbiome. Is how, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that your gut can control a lot of your biology. And so we wanted to look to see if meditation has an impact on your gut bacteria and what they do and how they, express and do things. And so that was an easy collection, right? You could convince people, and people do this in health settings all the time, to give us a stool sample before the event started for them for that week, and then one at the end of the week. And then the second aspect was take a popsicle stick, scrape your cheeks, fit into a tube, and we could collect cheek cells that we could do studies on. They're then archived and they go into our boxes and freezers, and we have them stored away. I was expecting maybe 200-300 people to bite and say, all right, we'll give you, it sounds like a lot, right? To ask them to do this. I made some videos on how to do the cheek scrape, and we had a collaborator make a video on how to do the stool collections. Really not a huge commitment. It would take you maybe 10 minutes to do all of those things. And you can do it on your own, so no staff time. You then literally drop them into the box and we freeze them down. We ended up getting 894 pre-samples and about 780 or 90 post-samples. So we have almost 800 matched samples. And so my mind is like on fire about what we can do with this, right? Now we've got the Garmin data on 1,000 people. We're getting their health surveys. And now we have 2 pieces of really, really cool biology that we could look at. The entire microbiome aspect of this large group. And then ultimately, we're looking for funding to do the next aspect is from the cheek scrape, is we can extract DNA and start looking at DNA methylation patterns for epigenetic changes that happen during that week. From those epigenetic changes, you can make lots of conclusions about, biological age and changes in other parameters of health and things like that. And then ultimately what's happening experientially in these individuals. So that is it's an amazing, massive data set. And so we started going through it. And it turns out that when you look through the 978 people and their intake surveys that we got, there are 18 things that people identify as problems that they came to the event with that have at least 30 people or more within that entity. So you can like anxiety, depression, PTSD, sleep disorders, hypothyroidism, diabetes, cancer. And so now you've got 18 of these things that the human condition suffers with that we have long-term capture data on. And so now we can start looking to see how does the microbiome of someone who is a cancer patient alter and change from someone who's completely healthy, and look at their age-matched controls and start making lots of sort of connections between this healthy individual and this person with cancer, and trying to see where they sit after that week-long experience. And you can look at it in a lot of granularities. Since this thing is on most people during the event, we can look to see what your heart is doing during a breakfast portion of the day versus when you're sitting there listening to a lecture where you're largely quiet, but you've got your mind intently focusing on maybe wandering a little bit like most of our minds do, and compare it really to that meditative experience where you're in that room meditating as a large group. And then you can get even more granular. During the meditation, we've timestamped the entire day. And so I know when each of the songs change during a meditation. And so now we can look at your heart rate and your heart rate variability during the breath portion of the meditation, during the meditative, emotional component of that. And then ultimately, when you're coming out of that meditation, and then what you look like before you went into that state, and what you look like hours after you came out of that state. And so we can start making lots of really cool analyses that then tie across that platform in 1,000 people. And it's mind-boggling to think what we're going to do.
Yeah, it's incredible. Actually, it's cool because you're not doing it. Everyone's in one area. They're all relatively sleeping at the same time. They're getting up at the same time. They're eating at the same time. They're eating the same foods at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a very like efficient way to study all these things because there's not a lot of external factors involved.
Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing petri dish, that
Yeah.
Toby describes. You can't do that in a sterile academic environment. I mean, you could bring 1,000 people into UCSD, but to keep them around for a week, it'd be tough. And so that's the beauty of these week-long events is you've really controlled for that environment.
Yeah, very cool. So tell us about what you actually learned from the data that was collected. I know you talked about the gut microbiome and how there's so much more diversity that's showing up after the meditations.
Yeah, so that was the initial pilot we did. So in getting prepped for the Marco Island event, we had run this small pilot as part of the Denver AFU sort of towards the end of 2021. I'd asked, there's about 70, 80 meditators at that time that are part of the San Diego group, and they're interested in getting involved in studies. And so I'd asked them to do this microbiome study just to see how it would be to collect samples and do all that stuff. But the caveat was they had to do something that was really a big ask. They had to give up meditation for 7 days. So no meditation, no listening to any transformative stories. They basically had to go into their stressful life with no relief. Out of the 70, 80 people, I only got 16 to bite, right? Like
Nobody wants to give up.
only 16 said we could do this. And it was incessant, the emails you get. Can I just listen to Joe's voice? I'm like, no, can't. It's a complete cold turkey withdrawal from everything meditative. The idea was to wash the system out of that stress relief kind of thing, put yourself into a stress state, and then we would collect a pre-sample, and then they were allowed to meditate to their heart's content. They could do whatever meditations they wanted, and go about their lives, and we collect a sample at day 7. So we did an initial analysis in that, and this was a non-petri dish experiment, right? These individuals were sleeping on their own schedule because they were going about their normal life in San Diego. Some of them were at the Denver AFU, so there was some control to that. They were eating whatever they could. I mean, we took a food log so we could see sort of what their food intake was, caloric intake, that kind of thing. And they were really experiencing meditation as individuals, not really as a group in this setting. And even with all of those confounding elements, we saw some dramatic changes from meditation and bacteria. The population of diversity of bacteria increased with meditation, and we were able to see some other chemical changes. The samples from Quantum are currently sitting at the core for sequencing, metagenomic sequencing. It's going to take a while. I mean, it's 1,600 samples they have to go through. So they're predicting about 3 to 4 months to get all the sequencing done, and then we've got a couple months of data analysis around that. We're doing a subset of this. We're focusing, 2022 with Inner Science, the launch is really the year of trying to understand cancer in this group of individuals a little better. And so we're going to purposely pick all of the individuals in Quantum that were cancerous or had some cancer background that they were trying to focus on during the event, and couple them to controls that were healthy, aged, and sex matched at the time, and then look at those populations for an analysis. We're hoping to present some of this data as a preliminary kind of thing during the San Diego week-long event in April coming up. We should hopefully have something by then. We're starting to look at the Garmin data. As you can imagine, it's massive. 1,000. So imagine we're getting a heartbeat every couple seconds for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months. And so we're starting to put that into a platform where we can look to see how each individual is transforming over time. So the analytics is really going to take a while to start putting together into a database that we can start looking at. But the initial sort of things we started looking at is what is the population we're looking at, and it's quite diverse, which is going to give us some really cool answers.
Very cool. I know you also talked about during the presentation your studies on COVID and this particular protein that you guys isolated, which is
Yeah.
actually such groundbreaking stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, so one of the things that happened, and this is, one reason why it took us so long to initially start this research is so the first event that we were collecting samples at, where Toby's group, Vitamed, was doing the sample collection, was at the Indian Wells event in 2019 in February. And then the world effectively shut down in March. And so we were not in our labs. And so that contributed to some of this lag in time and stuff like that. So in order to get back into the lab, we had to sort of reinvent some of the things we were working on. If you were working on COVID, you could come back and do certain things in the laboratory. And so we created some pseudoviruses that we could work in our lab space, which is a biosafety level 2 facility and these pseudoviruses look on the cell surface, on the viral surface, like a SARS-CoV-2 virus. They have the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2. The inside we replaced with a red reporter. So when this fake virus attaches to a cell like SARS-CoV-2 would, and the material gets transferred inside, that cell turns red, and we can track which cells are red. The idea was and a lot of the stuff we're doing with blood from individuals is this, and it's sort of a belief that, and sort of a scientific sort of assessment that this is true, right? So how do you capture the experience of an individual? And so one of the things that we've been looking at is that whatever happens to you in your body, your blood is a capture of that. This is why when you go to your physician, they do blood work, right? The blood tells you a lot about what's happening in your living system, stress, health, disease, those kinds of things. And so under that same token, that was the thought, right? That under a meditative experience, if you capture blood, you would capture elements of that meditative experience. And so what we then wanted to do was adopt that experience into a system that's never seen meditation, which is how we started these studies on this COVID pseudovirus study. So we basically took lung cells that you could buy from a company. These lung cells are the primary cells that COVID initially sees in your system. And so what we did is in a dish. So these are lung cells that have never meditated, right? They don't come from a meditating individual, hopefully, know of. And we can culture them and they divide and we can move them into new plates and they keep going forever and ever and ever and ever. So they become a very quality controlled system that you can do assays in. To have them then experience meditation, what we did is we took the blood from these meditating individuals before and after the event and exposed that plasma or blood environment onto these cells. Whatever was floating around in these individuals then was transferred onto these cells. So we've adopted that experience of meditation into a system that's never seen that. And then we can stress them in unique and strange ways and see what happens. And so in this assay, you basically let the cells meditate in a dish with this blood environment from the meditators. And then you come and challenge them with the pseudovirus. And what we noticed is that the cells that were incubated with plasma after the week-long event from a novice or an experienced meditator, it was able to exclude the virus from entering the cell, which we thought was really cool, right? So there's something, then you start connecting the dots. So there's something inside the blood after a meditative experience that prevents virus entry into that cell. And so then began sort of the quest to figure out what that factor was. And so, we're a molecular biochemical lab. And so there's lots of ways biochemistry wise that are quite simple to then fish out what those factors are. And so then we went fishing. We actually then, did a series of subtractive experiments. So we heated the sample. When you heat a sample, all of the protein in that blood gets denatured. And then you put that sample onto the cells. When we did that and we heat treated the samples, the effect went away. So now you can conclude that it's likely a protein that's being secreted in the blood of a meditator that's creating this effect. Now that we know it's a protein, we can then try to fish out what these proteins are. And so we went through this process called an immunoprecipitation, which is essentially a molecular fishing kind of experience. And so we fished out all of the things that bind to that virus. And then we shot these into what's called a mass spectrometer. which then identifies what these proteins are. You digest all the proteins into small pieces, put them into this really expensive machine. It tells you identity-wise what those things are, and then you know what proteins are involved. A number of proteins came up in this complex. There was one family that looked really interesting from a biological standpoint in terms of their function. And so we then identified this, then went and did some other assays and really looked at these serpent family of proteins in this mix. And it turns out that they're elevated and they have some biological potential. So we went on to characterize this. And so it was really sort of satisfying, right? This start to finish. We had this experience of intensive meditation that these individuals were doing. They released factors into their blood. Then ultimately, we were able to show created this unique protective effect from SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then we were actually able to identify an element of these factors that created this effect in isolation. I'm sure there's more than one or two of these factors that create this effect, but this one factor we did identify tracks perfectly with the biology of what you would predict. And we saw an elevation in the meditators. And so it's cool that the meditating brain can do this to biology. We think that this is then a gateway to everything else, right? So how does the mind then fix cancer? How does it fix Alzheimer's? How does it fix other things? And can it fix those things? Who knows? And so we've got cell models that we can adopt the meditative experience into Alzheimer's cells, into ALS cells, into cells that are cancerous. And if there is a biological effect at the level of the cell, we can then start fishing out those unique factors that create that biology as well. And so that's where we're headed. And this is again not rocket science, right? People have been experimenting in this realm for eons. A classic experiment is these studies on parabiosis. Right, years and decades ago, they'd taken animals that were old and young and connected their circulatory systems together. And it turned out that when you paired them, a parabiosis, right, they were sharing a circulatory system then. This young animal was able to make this old animal a little bit younger. And so there were factors that a young organism generates that creates youthfulness that you could then transfer into an older animal. Then the studies evolved. And so instead of physically pairing the circulatory systems and sewing them together, what people were able to do is take blood from a young mouse and transfer the blood products into an old mouse, and they saw the same effects. And so there were factors inside this young experience that then moved to this older experience. And so, I mean, I jokingly say we're doing 7.7 billion experiments a day, and we're capturing none of that data. We all have a unique experience that we live with as humans, and we're in stressful environments. We're in non-stressful environments. The world is a unique place, and all of these experiential things that we're exposed to our environment create a biology in our bodies that is resilient. And we're capturing one small element of that in meditation, where we're intensely asking individuals to meditate for a week. And then we're trying to see what kind of environment they're creating and what potential that environment has to change the human experience downstream. And it starts with cells and will eventually move into larger systems.
It's amazing. How did you know that it wasn't certain antibodies, either through natural immunity or through, through vaccination or anything like that, that these blood samples had, that was the cause for the pseudovirus not to be able to enter the lung cell?
Yep. So this was a concern that we had. And so we did look at antibody titers for SARS-CoV-2. So when you're infected or when you are vaccinated, you will elevate antibodies. And this is how your body fights off infection, right? It recognizes that target, and then you get this antibody response. Interestingly, the Indian Wells event happened before COVID really took off in the world, right? So none of those individuals had access to vaccines at that stage. The two other events that we looked at from individuals where we had blood from was Denver. Actually, it was Orlando in 2021 in April. And so this is when vaccines were just starting to become more mainstream. They were available to most of the healthcare workers. And then we started looking at the Denver retreat, which happened in July when vaccines were more prevalent and people had access to that. Out of that entire group of individuals, I think it was like 100 or so people that we looked at over that time frame, only 4 of them were vaccinated, and the major heavy vaccination group was in Denver. And so we've started to look at those 4 individuals in isolation to see if their antibodies are through the roof or they have a better response in this assay. The other thing we've done is we've gone back and, as controls, we've looked at vaccinated individuals that are non-meditators. And so now we have a group of individuals that should have elevated antibodies, and we're looking to see what their blood does in this same assay. And so we'll have an answer pretty soon of whether there's a correlation between how much antibody you have against this virus versus what happens in our assay when we're looking at pseudovirus infectivity. Early evidence suggests that there is something unique that's being elevated in the plasma of meditators after this meditative experience that's not really happening in the same line as these vaccinated individuals.
So what is like the most surprising thing that you've learned from the research that you've done over the last 2 years?
As a skeptic, I think the thing that has really sort of taken me to that next level is the fact that the mind can create a unique environment in your body that we can then track. All of the data seems to suggest that there is something that happens at the capture level of the blood, of the physiology, and these other things that could explain some of the amazing things we're seeing in health and resiliency in individuals. And I was expecting some element of that, but not to the level that we're discovering. And so it's really just blowing my mind, the fact that the mind can do these things. It's powerful.
Has it changed your views on life and how you approach it in any way? I mean, do you meditate a lot more now because of all the study that you or the research that you've conducted?
I meditate more than I ever have, but I would love to incorporate this. Like I said, if you could make this an hour part of your life, it would be transformative. And I struggle to do that, which I think is another reason why a lot of people come back to these events, is because they fall into the trappings of life, right? You're at an event, you're secluded, you're able to sort of check out of most of your daily duties, and you can focus for that week on this intensive event. When you get back to your normal life, most people who do these kinds of things, exercise, dieting, those kind of things, unless you make it a part of your daily normal routine of life, it's hard to incorporate long term. Most people will do it for a couple weeks and then they fall back into their normal patterns. I'm victim to that. And it's a busy lifestyle that creates this. And so I really, it's a mindset, and I struggle to do it. There's certain weeks that I'm very good about meditating, and there's other weeks where it's tough to find that time. And it's sad to say, right, that I can't find an hour for myself to create resiliency and health, but that's the struggle, I think.
Yeah, from after the event, I've had to like prioritize it in my life, and I know I need to do a better job of it. But I know that when I wake up first thing in the morning and don't do anything else but meditate, at
Yeah.
least I get that in my system, and it creates a momentum effect. So that's just like working out too, right? Like if we wait till the end of the day, oh, I haven't worked out yet, then it's hard
Right.
to like get out of the house, go to the
Yeah.
gym, that kind of thing. So I really have seen so many benefits to my life, and I can't wait to do the advanced follow up in Denver in a couple of months, actually next
Yeah.
month, and
Next one.
actually do some brain mapping with you and being a part of the study because I
Yeah.
really want to thank you. This kind of research is so needed, and I have a wellness center, and people who are into holistic medicine and meditation, spirituality, all this kind of stuff. There's not a lot of funding from pharmaceutical companies to fund this kind of stuff, even though we know that it absolutely works. And the fact that you're taking on this monumental project, and with the grace of God and the grace of so many amazing people who are involved in this study with you. So yeah, we just really want to thank you from a collective because it's so needed. And to marry the science and the mysticism together, that's really where we find common ground as humanity. You can't have one or the other because then we're imbalanced.
Yeah. No, we've got some amazing studies planned. And my brain keeps thinking about newer things that we're doing. And so we're really launching a series of studies that are going to take us into the next 4 or 5 years easily, and then beyond. And I suspect we're going to discover something from quantum that's going to lead to the next series of questions. And so we've got, a couple studies that we're planning for this year. San Diego is an amazing place because we're here. And so to have an event in San Diego really gives us access to tools and equipment that we would never be able to do anywhere else. And so we've got some big things planned for San Diego. We're going to try to do some fMRI scanning of people who are meditating before and after. We're launching a study called Genesis in San Diego, which is generating new insights into genetic signatures. And so the idea is to look at three elements of this. One element is twin sets. And so we're actually going to look to brain and physiologically and blood map twins that are having unique experiences. So one twin will be in the meditation room meditating. The other twin will be somewhere else listening to nothing or elevator kind of music. And we want to see how this twin's intense emotional state impacts this other twin that they're intertwined with, right? They share the same genetics. They, are connected in ways that we are not to other people. And we want to see how their experience changes, not only at the level of the brain, but is their blood chemistry changing at the same time? Is their physiology changing through this garment and those kinds of things? And so it's going to be an interesting, exciting sort of set of people we're looking at. And it's a diverse group. Some twin sets, they're both meditators. In other twin sets, neither of them are meditators. It's the first time to a Joe event. And in other twin sets, one's a meditator and the other's a skeptic. And so we're going to be able to create some interesting biology around that. We're also looking at sort of the experience of connectedness in individuals. And this is where genetics comes in. And I don't know about you, but the person in my life that I was closest to before she passed away was my mother, right? You form these intense bonds with your mother because she carried you for 9 months. And so we're actually doing a study and a lot of the inspiration for this comes from the community. I had one woman and then a couple others ask me in Marco Island if we were collecting breast milk. And I'm like, no, but that's an interesting idea, right? And so we're launching a study called Milk as part of Genesis, where we're going to look at what happens in antibodies and factors in breast milk when a mother is meditating during that week-long intensive experience. I suspect we're going to see some amazing changes. And this would be the start of thinking about how a meditating mother can transfer some of the positive elements of stress relief and factors to the child that's not meditating. And then a study I can't tell you about because there's some secretive elements, but it's going to be called Genes. And so we're going to look at some aspects of genetics as well as part of Genesis. And then later in the year, we're hoping to keep the environment consistent. We're going to launch Quantum 2 in Marco Island at the advanced follow-up later this summer. The idea then would be to get 1,000 people who are in the advanced community meditating and see what's happening to their experience over that intensive 4 days.
Amazing. Wow, that sounds incredible. And I know all these studies that you do require some funding. So can you tell us a little bit about how you're funded, what your needs are, and how can our community support you in this?
Yeah, so we've, at being in an academic lab, it's a no-brainer that we should write grants on this and submit them. And so we are, and we have. And NIH is a tough nut to crack. We've submitted 2 grants that have not done so well there. We'll get comments on the second one soon. It was reviewed and not discussed at all at the study section, which is a bummer. But so is the life of a scientist. I teach a course on scientific communication. And one of the things you learn as a scientist is to really get a thick skin, right? Take criticism well, and you're going to get rejected a lot of times. Resources are limited. Where we have really been fortunate and grateful and have a lot of abundance in moving this stuff forward is the research community has appealed to donors in this space. And there's people that want answers. And they're willing to put their foot forward to get these answers done. And so donors have come out of the community and really supported our research. And to have that resource has really taken this work to the next level. I mean, we can run a study like quantum without having to think about the financial resources that go into that. I mean, it's a massive study, right? To get garments to everyone is almost $100,000 affair for that event. To collect the data, to analyze it, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. For the microbiome, it's a couple $100,000 to do the sequencing. For the epigenetics, it's almost $1 million to do sequencing on that many samples. And so it takes a lot of money to do those things. And so there's a group of individuals that have seen what we're capable of, where we're headed with the research, and what kind of answers and questions we're going to unlock. And so they formed a nonprofit called Inner Science Research Funds, and they're really trying to get the academic groups well resourced in this space. And they're interested in the meditative experience. You know, they're interested in all kinds of meditation research that tie to Joe and to experiences outside of that as well. And Joe incorporates a lot of elements of meditative practices. And so we want to study those in pieces as well. And so Inner Science has really become sort of this conduit to move this research to the next level. And it's nice to have those resources to be able to do that and to ask and answer these big questions. It's amazing to be able to say we're going to run Quantum 2 in August, where if you had an NIH grant, you could run a quantum study once in a 5-year period, if that, and you would never be able to do quantum because there just aren't enough resources to look at 1,000 people. So it's really to think big and not have finances be the limiting factor in this. And this is what we're going to have to do to answer these big questions and to make this more mainstream is we're going to have to look at big, large studies like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're listening to this and you want to support this amazing research, please do so. Everybody knows how important meditation is who listens to this podcast. And, we're not getting funded from the pharmaceutical companies that, like I said, we need to support as a community. So please do so. So Dr. Hemal, why did you think you came here to Earth as Dr. Hemal Patel? What did you want to experience?
That's an interesting question, right? You think about sort of your trajectories in life and all these decisions that came and what was the one point that sort of guided you down to where you are? And I don't know. I mean, I grew up in India. I was born into this small, tiny village in northwestern India. And to think when I was born or when I was a young kid that I would end up in San Diego as a scientist looking at meditation, it wasn't even a part of sort of the life aspect, right? And then I had the mindset that I would always be a physician for many, many years. And then you meet someone who then changes your path for another sort of area, right? And then I really found research as a way to really use my mind to do something else and go down this path. And so the sort of the I guess I'm an individual that believes in fate, right? We're destined to do things that we're designed to do. And we ultimately in this world have free will, but that free will ultimately leads us to the path that we were expected to ultimately go down and get to. And I feel like I'm in the right place, doing the right thing with the right aspect of my life. One of the things that I stress to our 3 kids, and one of the things that I've stressed to mentees that come through my lab, is that you want to find something in your life to do that doesn't feel like work, right? That it's really just an organic, natural extension of who you are, who you want to be, and you just can't wait to get into your space to do that work. Science is like that for me. It's not work. I mean, I enjoy using my brain to come up with these crazy, amazing, cool experiments that then push the boundaries of our knowledge and really get to that next level. And I've done this for most of my career. I've had, one of the things that I sort of come up with is when I read something or sit and quiet my mind, these amazing, weird thoughts come in about biology and life and how the world exists. And it's amazing to have resources across my office and my laboratory where I can go and actually test that and see if that's truly real or not. And meditation is really making me stretch that aspect of my mind. I mean, I described recently some of these studies that we have planned. It's going to take the envelope and push it off the edge of my desk. But we're ready to do it. I think we're going to uncover some really, really amazing things.
Amazing. So beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on. And what's
Yeah.
so impressive is that we just scratched the surface of everything that you're going to be unraveling. And there's so much that has come out of just what you've shown us so far. So, yeah, I'm really excited to see the progress of everything you guys do, and happy to support in any way I can.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to seeing you in Denver. It'll be a good time.
Sounds good, buddy. Thank you so much.